me all right? Great. Well, it's wonderful to be back in Hiram. I was last here 5 years ago when I was just beginning research on this book. And it was in winter, and I didn't tell anybody I was really coming. I just dived into the Hiram archives, and you guys are just wonderful hosts as an institution. And it's great to be back here. This does genuinely feel like a homecoming. I was just handed my own name tag. But yeah, Tim is quite right. C.W. Goodyear is what it says on the book cover. I've always gone by Charlie. I was told a very long time ago that Charlie doesn't look good on a book cover. So you need to sound a little bit more austere. So C.W. Goodyear I became. And I'm here to talk to you all today about a foundational figure, of course, in Hiram's history and in the history of our nation, James Garfield. The question I typically start my talks with is, it's an answer to a question that I've received literally hundreds of times since I started writing this book about 5 years ago. And it's a question that biographers of presidents like Washington and Lincoln and Roosevelt never have to answer, which is, why did you write a book about James Garfield? And it's a very, let's see if this is going to cooperate. Good, yes. It's a question that goes back to where I was 5 years ago geographically, and then where we all were as a nation and still are politically today. 5 years ago, I was working as a ghostwriter in Washington, D.C. So I was helping people who were more important than me put their books together, basically. And I was struck at the time, and I still am, by the amount of division that seems to be overriding American society. And I was very interested as a researcher in finding a time in our history where similar conditions of division were overriding our nation, politically, socially, economically, racially. If anything, I wanted to find almost like a precedent for the times we were going through. And I wanted to find a figure who was leading the nation on a national level in a way that was trying to overcome that spirit of division. So I was drawn to Reconstruction in the Gilded Age, which is that delightfully vague post-Civil War and then post-Civil War period. And in reading the histories of that time, the same character kept appearing center stage from about the mid-Civil War up until 1881, which is a long stretch of time for anybody to be active on a national level politically. And more striking than this person, this character's omnipresence, was the way in which everybody else on stage with him, on the national political stage, spoke about him. And regardless of their own politics, regardless of whether they were Democrat or Republican, Greenbacker or civil service reformist, everybody had generally nice things to say about this one character. Sometimes it was passive aggressive, sometimes he's a little bit too nice kind of thing. But generally, again, it was all warm and appreciative. And that person, spoiler alert, was James Garfield. But going past that prolific nature of James Garfield, he was at the center of pretty much every single event of national importance from the Civil War through to a decade and a half later. But whenever he appeared on these stages, whenever he appeared in these histories of these times, his entire career would be summarized within a single sentence. And it would typically read as follows. It would be James Garfield, future president, would be assassinated within his first year in office. That is typically the story of James Garfield in our nation's history. But the deeper I go, the less fair that seemed to be. This is a quote from, I don't know if you can read it with the glare right now, but this is a quote from President Rutherford Hayes, who's another one of those bearded Midwestern presidents that everybody forgets about from the Gilded Age. And this is a quote that was given when Garfield was first nominated for the presidency. So before he even entered the White House. And Hayes wrote, "The truth is no man ever started so low who accomplished so much in all of our history. Not Abraham Lincoln or Benjamin Franklin, even." Which is an incredible statement to say. And if you know presidents like I do, they don't often praise each other like that, either way. And also look at that side profile of James Garfield. That is a stunning image. So he had looks to go with all of his accomplishments as well. But when Hayes was saying this, what did he really mean? Well, as a lot of us here today know, James Garfield was born on November 19th, 1831 in the Western Reserve of Ohio, which was, at the time, that was just starting to move beyond being the frontier of our nation. He was born, as I've since said on the book tour, I didn't put this in the book, but I think he was born to the lowest rung of American society that a white northern male could be born to. He was the last president to be born in a log cabin. He was raised by a single mother. His dad died before he was 2 years old. And as a matter of fact, James Garfield, the president, wasn't even the first James Garfield in his family. He was named after his elder brother who had died before he was born. So, you can see how that is a tough way to begin life. But then you fast forward to, you fast forward to his late 20s, so about the age I was when I was writing and researching this book. And he is a state senator, a college president of this great institution, what was then known as the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute. And he's also a very prominent preacher in the Stone Campbell movement, or the Disciples of Christ, depending on who you ask the name of that movement is. And he's doing all three of these things at the same time. And then you fast forward to what I since said is another year and change. And he is, for a hot second, he is the youngest brigadier general in the Union Army during the Civil War. And then you fast forward about another 2 years, and he is, per his description, he is the youngest congressman in the nation. And he's a little bit wrong on that. There was an at-large member from Oregon who was a few months younger than him. But in Garfield's memory, that wasn't quite, he didn't want to throw that in. He gave this interview when he was running for the presidency where he was summarizing his life, and he says in about 2 sentences, he goes, yeah, I was the youngest general, yeah, I was the youngest congressman, it was pretty great. And anyway, and then he takes office essentially halfway through the Civil War, towards the closing 2 years really, and he, what then follows is a 17-year career in the House of Representatives. He wins 9 consecutive terms in the House, and that doesn't sound like a lot to us today, because these days you send people to Washington and they don't return to their districts except in like caskets, because they just go to Washington and they never leave. But back in that time, and actually as a matter of fact, I found a piece of some records here at Hiram that suggested that Garfield's tenure in the House of Representatives, that was almost a record breaker by that period in American history. That was an almost unprecedented level of political domination for that time. And then while he's serving through these incredibly tumultuous times, and he's getting more and more powerful as a legislator, as a congressman, he's also building himself into, simply put, the most interesting man in the world, I'd argue. He begins a legal career while serving in Congress. He had been certified, he had been admitted to the Ohio bar in Columbus when he was a state senator, but he starts practicing the law for the first time as a congressman. And the first case he ever represents is the first case he wins, and he wins it in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. That is his legal debut. And it was a very famous case called Ex parte Milligan, which played, if you ask legal scholars, they'll recognize that case. It played a lasting role in determining the limits of civil versus military legal jurisdiction in wartime. Very important case. He also founded, as a congressman, he founded the first ever federal Department of Education. And he did that as a Reconstruction measure in the aftermath of the Civil War. And he has this great quote that he asked Congress of the time, and he's asking the House of Representatives, and this is a hard sell, by the way, but he challenges them. He says, are we to expand the bounds of American citizenship and make no provision to increase the intelligence of the citizen? And what he's talking about at that time, he's talking about what's happening in the post-war South. And he's also talking about what's happening in the Northeast, because you have millions and millions of immigrants arriving into the harbors of the East Coast from Italy, from Ireland. And he's basically saying, if our democracy is to function, we have to invest in our people, in all of our people, of all ranks of American society. So really forward-thinking stuff. He's also, as you can see here, these 2 articles on the left here, these are in the North American Review and the Atlantic. It's still online on the Atlantic, by the way. These are 2 columns that James Garfield wrote, 2 of many that he wrote, as a matter of fact, for these publications. And it shows you that he was also a pretty prolific writer. The first one, it's this series of articles in the North American Review that for certain congressmen have not aged very well. Because the title of the article is, Ought the Negro to be Disenfranchised? Ought he to be enfranchised? And Garfield is arguing against a rebuttal from a series of other congressmen that giving the vote to African Americans was not a mistake at all, should not be retroactively taken away. In a time where Reconstruction was starting to fall apart, Garfield was arguing very intensely for those policies to remain in place, which shows you his principles in a time where very few others, relatively speaking, shared those. And then that other article down here for the Atlantic, it's the currency conflict. It's a history of American monetary policy. And he's writing these as a senior congressman, and he's not handing it off to aides, as a lot of writers in politics do these days. He's doing these things himself. And then not only that, on the right here, this is something else that Garfield put together, and it is an original proof of the Pythagorean theorem. And he wrote that as minority leader of the House. And it's interesting, this is a little editorial that the editors of this journal attached, and they said, I'm not wearing my glasses, but I'll try to remember it correctly. You can read it right there. But they say something, we trust that this is something that members of both parties can unite on. So, fascinating figure. But again, he remains the only American to be a representative, a senator elected, and president elected all at the same time. He's the only American to ever be directly elected from the House of Representatives to the presidency. And all of that is typically not remembered as well because of the way that life ended. Garfield was the second president to be assassinated, and he was assassinated in a spectacular fashion. Literally, it was a spectacle, in a way that no other assassination, I'd argue, really has been. So the result is that, as I put it in the book, the arc of an incredible life is eclipsed by how it ended. And so that's what kind of drew me in. And to bring it back to me, vain as I am, as a young writer in DC, I was reviewing this legacy. I felt intrigued, curious, and jealous for what James Garfield had accomplished. But again, the most impressive thing about him, I'd argue, is something that I can directly connect to, in many ways, where he started life and where he became a real man, Hiram. It was, again, in an increasingly tempestuous and polarized political climate. He remained this friendly figure to all comers. He did not allow politics to interfere with his personal relations in Washington, at home in Ohio, or anything of that sort, which is increasingly rare. And this is a quote from the president of Cornell University, the first president of Cornell University, Andrew Dixon White, very famous American educator. And this is White later writing in his own memoirs. He's describing his memory of a conversation with James Garfield. And White writes, this talk that he had with James Garfield, remains to me one of the most interesting things in my life. And what did he find interesting about it? One thing which struck me, which is judicially fair and even kindly estimates of men who differed from him. And then White goes on to write, this is a welcome contrast from the behavior of other politicians who seem to regard their political enemies as enemies of the human race. So that's really something. Now, as I've explained to Tim Garfield numerous times, when you do a book tour, eventually you settle into a stump speech. Because you're typically talking to the same kinds of audiences. You're talking to people who know nothing about James Garfield, who have no connection to him personally. And so you develop a little bit of a routine about how you introduce him, how you talk about the significance of his life, et cetera, et cetera. What's nice about these talks and talking to you fine people is I get to change from my routine. And what I'd like to do today, actually, is I'd like to illustrate a little bit the place of Hiram College and Hiram itself in James Garfield's career, how crucial and central this place was to the career of this great American, this American who is described by numerous other peers of his as being one of the most accomplished and influential American statesmen of all time. His legacy rests in many ways on this place, and of course, vice versa, because Hiram, of course, owes a lot to him as well. And so that's what I'd like to spend this talk really discussing, is how the role Hiram played in the ascent of James Garfield. And this is no clearer, by the way, than if you open on the insert flap of Francis Marion Green's History of Hiram College. You know, whose portrait do we have right on the inside? It's James Garfield. Now, so as we get into this, the key aspect of James Garfield's life that so many people found so compelling is that he came from nothing, relatively speaking. He was this famous rags to riches story, this fulfillment of the American dream. The last president born in a log cabin who rose to the White House. And what was interesting about early on in his career was he would repeatedly, throughout his entire life, people would congratulate him on overcoming the arduousness of his upbringing, the arduousness of growing up in this region, as he did. Externally, he had to kind of grin and take it. One of the great tragedies, I'd argue, of our political system is that we ask our leaders not to monetize, but to capitalize on their hardships in life. We ask them to kind of cast, their ordeals as something that's, worth giving them a vote for. So Garfield had to, throughout his life, he would endure a lot of compliments about how far he's come, but inside he always felt a little bit different. And you can see that here. This is a letter, actually, that he wrote from wartime Washington, D.C. And being from D.C., I can tell you, it's full of ambitious people who are trying to network. So people would come up to him. He was this hotshot young general. He had made a real name for himself, by the way, through the way he deployed a lot of people from this place in the battlefield. And people would come up to him and they'd compliment him. He wrote this letter home, though, partway through the war, and I'll read it for you. To some men, the fact that they came up from poverty and single-handedness is a matter of pride, but I lament sorely that I was born to poverty. Precious 17 years in which a boy with a father and some wealth might have become fixed in manly ways. Let no man praise me because I was born poor and without a helper. It was in every way bad for my life. With people who accomplish a great deal in life, especially those who come up from nothing, relatively speaking, when they are congratulated eventually on all that they accomplish, they're not thinking about congratulating themselves. They're not slapping themselves on the back. Instead, as Garfield's doing right here, they're asking themselves what more they could have done if they had the same advantages that so many other people take for granted. It is a difficult way to grow up. And I'd argue that you can connect this inner feeling of this, for lack of a better term, a chip on Garfield's shoulder to the way that he came into Hiram. He came into the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute, the eclectic, I'm just going to call it, as many people did that day to keep it brief. And the way in which he led this institution. This was the eclectic as it looked about the time that Garfield came in. He joined in the second year of the institution's creation. And the eclectic had been founded, of course, due to in many ways, the perceived discrimination that members of the Disciples of Christ movement, the Stone Campbell movement, felt in other parts of the Western Reserve at that time. The Disciples of Christ were, and they still are to this day, a very interestingly structured church, an interestingly structured member of the Christian family. What was fantastic about their philosophy is that great tagline of theirs: we speak where the Bible speaks, we are silent where it is silent. It's this very empowering movement. It gives a lot of, it doesn't have, in many ways, or it didn't have back then, as much emphasis on a formal clergy as much as it did on empowering regular congregants to serve as their own theologians, their own ministers, their own people who are free to decide what Christian theology really is. A young James Garfield took to that movement, that type of Christian movement, like a fish to water. He was this young, incredibly ambitious, and very learned country boy. So he was an enthusiastic convert to this movement. And anyway, when the disciples were creating this place, with the help of great local leaders like Zebulon Rudolph, Garfield came here as soon as he could as a young man, and it became kind of an episode to remember in local history. Here you can see, this was written by Burke Hinsdale back in the day, but you can see what the founding principles of this school really were. The aims of the school were both general and special. More narrowly, they were these: to provide a sound scientific and literary education, to temper and sweeten such education with moral and scriptural knowledge, and to educate young men for the ministry. That was not quite what James Garfield was here for, or what he came here for. And this is also a bit of an explanation as to why the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute was called the Eclectic initially. Because eclectic is a funny name for a school, isn't it? It sounds like you're kind of throwing things together and figuring out what's working. But it explains here, a thing is called eclectic that claims the right of freely choosing from all sources. So it was this place of, relatively speaking, at least it was intended to be a place of freedom of thought, freedom of expression, which aligns very well with the style of the Disciples of Christ movement in this region at that time. And, but Garfield, as a young man, he came here to really prove himself in many ways. He had very famously worked kind of a hard-scrabble, blue-collar life. He had worked a stint on the Ohio Canal, which became very useful political imagery later on in his life. He had taken really strongly as a young man to schooling. There's these great stories that Eliza Garfield, his mother, would later share and that he would later write about. Garfield, for all of the romance that would later be made of his of the work he would do in the fields, of having to be a carpenter as kind of this young, impoverished boy in the Western Reserve, he was never really good at manual labor. He was actually, if you read a lot of the old accounts, he hurt himself all the time. He would, his cousins would describe him, falling off a barn and being concussed for 2 weeks. He had with scythe work, he would multiple times he would hit himself in the foot, and scythes are incredibly sharp. A little touch is all you need to be out of commission for a while. And his brother Thomas, who his older brother, who had a much harder life in many ways. Thomas would, as an old man, after his younger brother's assassination in the White House, Thomas would remember James falling under a water wheel in the area, and Thomas is standing there on the side of it going, well, he's finally died. But then the young James comes out on the other side and he's saying, oh, well, at least I got to see that water wheel from the inside. Which shows you he had this unique intellect that everybody around him could see, but he had very few means to really thoroughly pursue it. At that time in this part of the country, there was a great social emphasis on education. Of course, the Western Reserve was settled primarily from immigrants from New England. And those Yankee immigrants took with them an emphasis on the importance of education. However, the amount of farm work that needed to be done in this area meant that a lot of the schooling was part-time. It was seasonal. It was done in small district schools, and it was typically fairly expensive to try to go any further. When James returned from his brief stint on the Ohio Canal, he had exhausted all schooling that district schools could really provide him. He decided that manual labor was not the life for him. And his mom, Eliza, who was again also a foundational figure in his life, entrusted him kind of with the family savings to send him to more expensive schooling. That eventually led him here. That eventually led him to this place. And when he arrived at Hiram, very famously at the Eclectic Institute, he still could not really afford to be a full-time student. So what did he do? He became a janitor part-time while getting whatever education he could here. He was sweeping the floors, he was setting fires, he was starting fireplaces, not and very famously, he was a very loud ringer of the college bell. That's how you rouse the students to get their day started. And we read the accounts of other students, and they say, yeah, that bell always rang at 5 a.m. So he was very diligent with that. And this is just another quote down here. Corydon Fuller was another student of the Eclectic, and this is a note that Garfield wrote Corydon not long into their education together. By the way, Corydon Fuller was also somebody who was from a pretty hardscrabble background. And in one of their exchanges, Garfield writes about how satisfied they are. They both had to work part-time to afford their schooling here. And they took great satisfaction from working part-time and still being able to beat other richer students in their studies. That was something they really bonded over. But here you see how agonized James was for advancement, how much he really, truly had this determination to prove himself and to conquer his surroundings. He writes, "Oh, Corydon, those fires that we have so often felt, I lie here alone in my bed at midnight, tossing restlessly. I feel that there are but two tracks before me, to stand at least among the first or die. That's how much he wanted to prove himself. So eventually, within the space of a year, Garfield has gone from being a part-time student, a part-time janitor, to being a part-time teacher here, as well as a part-time student. He has exhausted the opportunities available for him. He's also formed lasting social connections. Names like Almeda Booth, Burke Hinsdale, James Harrison Rhodes, and of course, Lucretia Rudolph here. These are connections that he's met within his first few years at this school. And they're going to be his inner circle essentially for the rest of his life in many ways, especially Lucretia, of course. However, he eventually exhausts what is available at Hiram. He outgrows this place in many ways. And he decides that he needs to seek education elsewhere, at least for a time being. And so he gets this crazy idea that he's going to try to go east to the Ivy League or somewhere else. And he applies to 3 schools, or at least he sends letters of interest to 3 schools. He writes to Yale University, he writes to Brown, and he writes to Williams College. And Yale and Brown's deans both get this letter from this random corner of Ohio, from this country boy, and they write back and they say, well, if you want to apply, here's our catalog, see you later. And then that was that. And then the president of Williams, Mark Hopkins, a very famous educator, writes back to James Garfield and says, we shall be glad to do what we can for you here at Williams. And that line, Yale and Brown, Garfield writes about these snooty deans, right? He's saying, he writes specifically of sensing aristocracy in there right back. He feels looked down on by these people, and that shows you again, he's got a bit of a fragile ego there. He feels kind of disrespected by being written in such a way. The president of Williams writes back and says, hey, we'll do whatever we can to help you. Thank you for your interest. That appeals to Garfield's ego. And so he decides he's going to go to Williams. And so he leaves Hiram, and it's a tragic partition in many ways. He is aggrieved and saddened by having to leave so many of his friends behind. He has tearful partings from Almeda Booth, from Burke Hinsdale, and especially from Lucretia, his future wife. They have quite a ways to grow together before they finally decide to tie the knot, by the way. And then afterward, even. But Garfield gets to Williams, and we see some very funny behavior from him. That might be a little bit too small for you guys to read, but this is one of the letters that he wrote home. Garfield lands at Williamstown, and he is immediately intimidated by all the people around him. Here he was a big fish in a small pond, and he had felt constrained by, for lack of a better term, how far he could grow in this setting. He gets to Williams, and he has an opposite problem. He has 42 classmates. He's transferred in as a junior, so he's partway through the undergraduate experience. And a lot of his classmates have already attended preparatory schooling at Harvard and Yale and these other Ivy League schools. So Garfield arrives and he's thinking, oh, I'm going to get blown out of the water here. This is a whole new, set of issues. And that's actually when he writes to Corydon Fuller, and he's describing how agitated he is at being, he must defeat this new competition. But it shows, this shows you his kind of character that's starting to emerge. He is throughout his entire life, and I attribute this to his Midwestern upbringing, he is incredibly militantly friendly and polite with every single person he comes into contact with. I have since described him on the book tour as being a pathologically reasonable person. He is even in the face of otherwise rudeness, he is terrified of offending or giving the impression of offense to anybody else. So what he does in his first week at Williams, he individually meets with all 42 of his classmates. He tries to befriend them. And then he writes this great letter home. And he writes, I have met all 42. I have every reason to believe that at the end of this term, I will be able to defeat 37 of them. So he was going person by person to say, nice to meet you. And so he walked away saying, yeah, I can meet that guy. Which was hilarious. And there's a great anecdote from this time. I believe it happened at Williams. Other Garfield biographers have this happening here, but I think this is a Williams anecdote. He is struggling to defeat one of his classmates in the classics. There is one student who is a holdout who he can't beat in the classroom. And Garfield is incredibly agitated by this, and he can't figure out what this competitor's secret is. And so he's studying in his dorm room one night, and he looks out the window, and he sees that the light in his competitor's dorm is still on. And so Garfield says to himself, and he later gives this account in a speech in DC, that's how we know this happened. And he says, he says to himself in this time, okay, I'm going to keep studying as long as that light is on. And then when it goes out, I'm going to keep on studying for 15 more minutes. And that's how I'm going to finally defeat this person. And the way he tells it is, that's what he did. That's how he won. Very interesting. Now he graduates as high in his class as a junior could. He's given the honor of what's called the metaphysical oration. He's able to, he's essentially second to the valedictorian. There's a technical term for that that's escaping me right now. But immediately, Garfield he's presented kind of a dilemma. And as a matter of fact, he's been presented this throughout his entire last year at Williams. The eclectic needed new leadership. Its existing president at the time, Hayden, had seemed a bit he had lost the support of the common student. He had seemed a little bit too infused with what one other member of Hiram called the theological odium. Like he was a little bit too, he was more of a devotee of the Christian movement than he was the educational experience that students were looking for. And there's a lot of agitation going on in the ranks of this young school. So Garfield had been a very popular teacher when he initially left for Williams. He had gone on and he had won renown in a great Eastern college. And so when there was murmuring in the ranks from people like Almeda Booth, from people like Burke Hinsdale, they started thinking, you know who might be a good next president, who's somebody we could put in here as a new leader of this institution? It would be James. So we need to lure him back. So they start writing these very interesting letters to Garfield as a student. They start saying, we know you're getting offers to go teach in Troy, New York, or Great Barrington, Massachusetts. We think if you come back here, there's a path to you becoming president of this school. And Garfield plays very coy. He is genuinely, and this is true of every single time a new political position was open in front of him, he had the same kind of attitude. He was open to advancement, but he was very afraid of looking like he was reaching for this new job. And so he writes a series of essentially flirtatious notes back to the teachers at the Eclectic. And then there's this great line that he says, though, in one of these letters. He goes, well, if the presidency is thrust upon me, I might respond to it as Sam Houston did. And so if the presidency is thrust upon me, then I shall do what I want about accepting. I'm not going to take any active movement. So he comes back to the Eclectic, and he starts off as a regular teacher, but within just a few months, essentially, President Hayden, he resigns from his job, where the exact circumstances of that resignation are a little bit ambiguous, and he is replaced with a council of teachers who are to act as nominal head of the school in Hayden's absence while a permanent replacement is found. And look at this press coverage at the time. These are newspaper clippings from the era. And when Hayden's departure is announced, you see right there, the teachers of Hiram Eclectic Institute elected Professor James A. Garfield, chairman or nominal head of the school. He is chairman of the board of teachers. And then you fast forward to, not even 8 months later, and Professor Garfield occupied the position of principal for the last year and has proven himself well fitted for the post. So it's being written of in hindsight like there was no council at all. They're saying that he was principal the entire time in practice. And so one of the things in the book that I end this chapter on, I say, so the date of the first Garfield administration would always be a matter of debate. Because, technically he was running the place already. Now, how did he run the school? I had the real pleasure, about 10 minutes before I started talking here, I met a descendant of Charles Henry, who was one of Garfield's students at Hiram. And it's when you read accounts of these young men and women at this school and the way in which they bonded with their principal, it's really fantastic to see. He is smothering them with affection. He is, when students are feeling homesick, he, as their principal, is putting his arm around their shoulders. He's telling them everything's going to be okay. When students have to withdraw because they're running low on funds that are needed to work back on the family farm, he writes handwritten goodbyes, and as he's giving them kind of a goodbye hug and handshake, he slips it into their hat band, so they find it later. He's playing rugby and cricket and things like that on the school grounds with the students. It is, as I described in the book, it's a liberalization. It's a warming. It's a new style of leadership that perfectly reflects the new principle. And I'd argue it is fatherhood. It's him being there for young boys as no one else was really there for him. And it's very touching to see that. And actually, there's no better example than this quote from Charles Henry, from one of Garfield's young students. And this is, Henry had been tasked with giving a speech before a gathering of graduating Hiram students. And he wants advice for how to give this oration well. So he goes to Principal Garfield and he asks him, what are your tips for rhetoric? How can I impress the crowd? Garfield gives him a few. Henry gives this talk, and then he leaves the stage, and then as he's walking, back to his rooms, he feels himself being lifted off the ground. And he hears from the laughter behind him, it's the principal, it's Principal Garfield. And as an old man, Henry writes this in his memoirs. He says, looking back over a bridge of years, through storms and toil and smoke of battle, that was one of the happiest moments of my life. Garfield's praise was dearer to me than all. His approbation was worth years of toil to secure. And so that sets us up very well for the next great stage, I'd argue, of Garfield's life. By the way, this kind of shows you, and this quote right here, this adds a different layer to Garfield's leadership of this institution. This is something he wrote to another one of his friends in town, James Harrison Rhodes. And he's writing, if I do not take the, because throughout his life, by the way, Garfield had these crises of confidence about what he really wanted to do for his living. Even when he was like 5 terms into Congress, he's saying, I don't really know what I want to do for my profession. he flirted with leaving Congress for the law many, many times. But this is before he even ran initially. And he says, if I do not take the law, and this is before he really returns to the eclectic as its principle, he writes, the next best course seems to me to be an educational and political one. The latter, politics, to be reached through the former, education. So to add a little bit of a layer here, no better way to reach local public prominence than to be the head of a significant local school, than to be seen as kind of a mentor figure to literally hundreds of men and women of the community, and to be a prominent preacher in the area as well. One of the lessons, I'd argue, of his public life is there is a way to do service to your country and your community and yourself as well. And Garfield was always very, very good at kind of balancing between those instincts. So the ascent begins. Fort Sumter. Sumter falls, and civil war is upon the nation. Garfield is a state senator in Columbus. He had managed to be approached by the local Republican Party of this district when the incumbent died, and he made sense as a good replacement because, again, prominent local educator who everybody liked, who was very well known for his Republican policies, a natural recruit for the state senatorship. Anyway, Sumter happens, and Garfield is very excited. He actually writes, I am glad we are defeated at Sumter. I believe it will rouse the people. This war will soon assume the shape of slavery versus freedom. The world will so understand it, and I believe it will redound to the good of humanity. Garfield is a radical Republican by this stage. And what is a radical Republican? Radicals were, for lack of a better term, they were Republicans who were to the left of Lincoln socially. They were as firebrand progressive as you could come in that time. Where Lincoln was very slow, at least publicly, to warm up to the idea of the full abolition of slavery. He had to be very careful with managing his wartime coalition. The radicals believed from the very beginning of the war that the end of slavery and that the removal of racial inequality wasn't ancillary to the end of the Civil War. That was the core rationale behind the entire conflict. That was why the conflict had happened. They believed that it was, in many ways, and Garfield believed this too, that the Civil War was divinely orchestrated to teach America, as Garfield put it, its sin against various races in its initial formation. The radicals believed that the Civil War was not this interruption to the American Republic. It was a second American Revolution. That was how thoroughly they understood the nature of the cause. So Garfield, from a very early point in this war, he was in favor of the immediate abolition of slavery, the immediate legal equality of all the races in America, the immediate political equality. He wanted to give the vote to every single kind of American. And I'm from Louisiana, so he also believed in the disenfranchisement, exile, and execution of leading Confederates. So you look up my family tree, and you were like, uh-oh. And so he is one thing that was great about him, he was so present. He seemed to know exactly what the issues of his day would be 4 years in advance. So at the beginning of the war, he is predicting a long, bloody, sanguinary civil war. He foresees that it will eventually assume overtly the shape of slavery versus freedom, which was not the war Lincoln was fighting. Lincoln was arguing fiercely that the war was not about slavery, that it was about the sovereignty of the Union, keeping the Union together. The South was fighting to protect slavery, that's true. The North was fighting to keep the country together, technically. Those two things can be true at the same time, at least initially. But Garfield and the other radicals, they knew what this war was really about. They knew that the shape that it would assume to come. They knew the way it would be remembered. So Garfield's terribly excited. He wants to be in conflict. He wants to take up a commission in the Union Army. Fortunately, he has a very good source of recruits for his regiment, the 42nd Ohio. And who are his recruits? It's his former students. It is members of the Hiram community. There are these great letters that are written to him from his former students, and I wish I'd included them here, but they're writing to him as grown men, and they're saying, Mr. Garfield, Principal Garfield, you have been of such great service to me in my life that my great wish is to be of service to you. Whichever course of public duty you feel called to, I will be there behind you. So he had taught hundreds of local students. Many of which were willing to follow his lead. And you can see here, this is taken from the formal regimental history of the 42nd Ohio, the regiment that Garfield would later lead. And you see here, much of its earlier inspiration, the inspiration for the regiment, came from the Eclectic Institute, they put that in quotes, of Hiram, of which honorary James A. Garfield, then a leading member of the Ohio Senate, was president. So students here, during the term that ended in July, the students were practicing their own military formations on the lawns. They were getting ready to go to war. There were a few, I'll put this here, a few who couldn't wait for Garfield to get his act in gear. They entered their own regiments. But there was, he came back eventually, and he was hosting meetings, he was hosting sermons in local churches, and he was getting his former students to go to war for him. And they obliged. They were drilling in in Columbus actually, for a few months, and then finally they were sent to a new frontier in the conflict. Garfield was given what seemed to be this kind of throwaway assignment to purge eastern Kentucky of rebel forces. East Kentucky was seen as I don't know how much things have changed, but it was seen as being no one really wanted it. It was kind of an inconvenient area. It was very poorly developed, and there were a few thousand rebels reportedly who were wandering the area, raiding, local Union sympathetic towns, kind of stirring up all this trouble. So Garfield was sent there under the command of General Don Carlos Buell to purge this region of rebel scum, and he's very excited by this assignment. He takes his 42nd to Ohio, and that's exactly what they do. It's a very interesting campaign to read about in hindsight. They lead this dashing, daring series of maneuvers through the area against the local rebel commander, and it culminates in something called the Battle of Middle Creek, which is this almost spontaneous conflict that is relatively bloodless, but it gets, by virtue of its timing, because this is relatively early in the war, the Union is not doing well on the battlefield. So any Union victory, especially after Bull Run, is going to get blown out of proportion. And that's exactly what happens with Garfield's victory, with the students that he takes from Hiram over there. And this is the front cover of the New York Times. And who do we have being written about on the right there? Colonel Garfield's victory. And this is exactly the kind of glory that he's trying to win in the national level. Some of the advice that's being written to him from his friends here, they're writing, you must make sure that whatever service you do in the Army serves your political advancement, because this country is going to be led for 20 years by the people who fight this war. So he's very cautious of whatever publicity he's going to win. So you know, his campaign there just gets blown crazy out of proportion. The stories are just wild. If you read the fine detail there, they describe him as being at the front of this cohort of student soldiers who are charging the rebel hill, and Garfield rips off his army jacket and throws it into a tree. And then he writes, "Going boys, give him Hail Columbia." And he draws his sword and he charges. And you know, all of which is fiction. But none of that happens. But James Rhodes, one of the people who remained here as a teacher during the Civil War, writes to Garfield, who's in the field, and says, "Is any of this true?" And Garfield goes, no, not at all. We did win, but it wasn't like that. And Rhodes goes, "Well, it's doing you very good service in the public mind here, so I don't compare it to anything." And so that's the fighting part of this campaign. The tragedy happens after, and this is his handwriting, and I'm just putting this up here to show you guys. When you write a biography of somebody, you become fluent in their handwriting, and sometimes it gets very tough to read. But fortunately, I've typed it out. The bad weather, winter weather in eastern Kentucky ends up leading to epidemics. Rains fall, rivers rise, a lot of the encampments flood, and you know, when there's standing water anywhere, you're going to get an outbreak of some serious illness. The ranks of Garfield's soldiers, his boys, are decimated. A lot of eclectic students start dropping like flies. They describe, there are descriptions that he writes home of literally having to prop up his old students as they're sick, as they're begging to be sent home, as they're dying. And this is the most compelling story that I found, actually, of all of his ordeals during this time. And this is him writing to his wife, Lucretia. "I declare to you there are fathers and mothers in Ohio that I hardly know how I can ever endure to meet. A noble young man from Medina County died a few days ago. I enlisted him, but not till I had spent 2 hours answering the objection of his father, who urged that he was too young to stand the exposure. He was the only child. I would rather fight a battle than to meet his father." So this ebullience, this excitement, this kind of young, let's go get him, let's go do our national service, let's serve valiantly. Battle was an exciting experience. But it was only after where you start seeing these awful losses, the humanity, the soberness of the situation really starts to come out. Garfield matures by saying goodbye to a lot of kids that he had known since they were kids. He starts to develop a much more mature view of war. And he goes on to become elected to Congress, and he manages to do this halfway through the war, essentially. He gets parted from his regiment. He gets parted from the 42nd Ohio because Garfield eventually gets promoted up the ranks. He gets promoted away from his boys. But he never really forgot them. He manages, by the way, once he gets reassigned, he starts writing letters home to his community here. And he is campaigning in new areas of the South. He's campaigning through Alabama. He's campaigning through parts of Mississippi, Corinth. And he's really, for the first time, he's seeing slavery with his own 2 eyes, being practiced en masse in the fields. And he is appalled that the Union Army is, at that time, limited in the ability that it can disrupt him. Lincoln was not fighting an abolitionist war by that point in our nation's history. There were severe restrictions on what Army officers could do to disrupt slavery, because again, the Northern armies were being told to respect Southern property rights. You know, when you're fighting a counter-insurgency campaign, try to keep the loyals nice. And unfortunately, at that time, property in the South included human beings. So Garfield is writing these awful letters home. How describing having to hide runaway slaves in his camp against orders to stop them from being captured and sent back to their masters. He also writes, and this shows you how far-seeing he was. He writes about seeing that out of this war, these are his words, there will spring a host of new dangers and new questions, the settlement of which will be of even more importance than the war itself. He's talking about Reconstruction. He's talking about winning the peace that's going to follow. So he writes home and he says, by the way, this is in the same letter, he writes, I think I can be of more service in solving these questions in Congress than in the Army, which is his way of saying, please elect me to Congress. So he gets sick, he comes home, and that coincides just perfectly with his ability to get elected to a House seat. So he goes to Washington, and by the way, this is an excerpt from the diary of Salmon Chase, Treasury Secretary for the Lincoln administration, also a very famous Ohioan. And this shows you how much Garfield is still identifying with Hiram as his home base. By the way, he is still, of course, principal of this school while he's serving in the Army and while he's in Congress. He can't let it go. But this shows you, so this is from Chase's diary, and he's saying, this fine officer, Garfield, was a laborer on a canal in his younger days. A large part of his regiment, he said, was composed of students from his college. So he's still, the Hiram story is a big part of the young Garfield story. And he never really moved on, he never really forgot. This place was always, and especially as his national career gained momentum, this was his citadel. This was the place he could always come home and feel at peace. There's some funny letters, by the way. So his regiment, the 42nd, a lot of his boys from here, they eventually got sent down to New Orleans, which is my hometown. And there's this great line that one of them wrote back to him, because they all stayed in touch, of course. And one of his officers wrote, my dear General Garfield, New Orleans is a fine place in a modern Sodom, if there ever was one. And then he goes, if it should ever be necessary to destroy this American Paris, no miracle is necessary. Enough rain around the headwaters would reduce it all to ruins. They were very smart. That was good foreknowledge. So if we move forward a little bit, by the way, this also shows you how the relationship stayed in place going forward. Back in those days, the local congressmen had a tremendous amount of power over who had jobs in the federal bureaucracy, who had these plum government jobs. This was called patronage, also known as the spoils system. The federal bureaucracy, the federal civil service, there were very little regulations around how jobs were awarded in it. So they basically became easy money and easy jobs for local political leaders to abuse. That was a major issue of this time. It was a defining issue of Garfield's life. But it shows you this letter. This was from a veteran of the 42nd who writes, anyone who used to belong to the 42nd Ohio must be helped to anything he wants. You are our member of Congress. We look to you to push our advancement. So veterans of this regiment, members of the Hiram community, including, by the way, Charles Henry, your ancestor, they were first in line for a lot of very important government jobs. Charles, I'm going to use your ancestor's trajectory actually as a very good example of this. Charles Henry had been one of Garfield's students here. He was the guy who was saying, happiest moment of my life was when Principal Garfield complimented me in my speech. He serves in the 42nd Ohio. He's there, he's fighting in East Kentucky, he's down in New Orleans. In the aftermath of the war, he needs a good job. Who does he go to for that job? James Garfield. What job does he get? He becomes an agent in the local post office service. And he gets that job through Garfield's appointment, through Garfield's recommendation. And the chapter in Henry's memoirs where he discusses this appointment to being local, post office agent, it's called Mailbags and Politics. And as I write in the book, you're left to wonder whether any letters were opened before their proper destination, because Henry describes using this job to be, as he puts it, a political intelligencer for Garfield. So he's keeping an eye on what's really going on locally. And then, by the way, when Garfield becomes president, Frederick Douglass is the marshal for the District of Columbia. It's a very, it's a ceremonial job, but it's a very prominent one. It's especially, by the way, for African Americans in that day to be a marshal, a top judicial officer in the District of Columbia. Garfield takes that job away from Frederick Douglass. Who does he give it to? Charles Henry. And when Garfield is actually eventually assassinated, by virtue of Henry's position, he's the one who gets to sign the death certificate for the assassin. So there's quite a poetic arc there, I'd argue. Anyway, if we fast forward to a few years, Garfield is minority leader of the House. The Republican Party in 1880 is terribly divided. the Rutherford Hayes administration has essentially presided over a fracturing of the Republican Party. You have all these different factions that are all terribly wrought up with each other, and they all have their own candidates for the presidency. Independent observers realize that if any of these factions candidates for the president win at the nominating convention, then they're going to lose in the fall to the Democrats, because no other faction would support the candidate of another. So they need somebody who is nice and agreeable, who gets along with every single faction, who seems like somebody who could unite all these factions of Republicans together and still win in the fall with enough general appeal. They all land on the same name, or many of them do. They all land on the name of Minority Leader James Garfield of the House. And so they approach him privately and they say, hey, look, convention's coming up. All these candidates are losers. You need to be the guy to come in, and you can actually unite this party. And he turns them down. He says he is not interested. No. My name must not be used. He's actually a floor manager for another candidate. But and Tim's heard me say this line before, but being in DC, I can tell you there's no such thing as somebody in Washington who is not interested in the presidency. So for all of the no's that Garfield's giving out, he leaves the window open a little bit. So he goes to the convention. He is a floor manager for another candidate. He does things throughout this competition that convince enough people he is the right man to unite the party. He does all these parlor tricks. He starts interrupting speakers, seemingly accidentally, to draw attention to him. The people who are trying to pitch him to run for president, they seed these viewing galleries above the main floor. They hire members of the public to stand there and applaud every time Garfield down here gets up and moves. So they're trying to be very careful about it. He blocks other delegates from kicking out delegates from other factions of Republic. He would say, "Who are we to challenge the republicanism of anybody else here?" He plays his cards very well. Eventually, the convention unexpectedly swings for him, and Garfield, he stands up to try to stop his own nomination. And if you want to be cynical, that's exactly what he needed to do to convince people he is the right man for the job. The reluctant prince, and who's there by his side? It's Charles Henry. So he has his Hiram boy still there with him on the scene. So he wins the nomination, and what follows has been very well written about. The campaign draws on the romance of his time and his leadership of his life from all the campaign biographies, by the way, of that time. They follow the same general formula. It's always, it's from the log cabin to the White House, from the towpath of the Ohio Canal to the White House. They all, it's all this rags to riches kind of story, and Hiram's a very big part of that. And as a matter of fact, I'm gonna go forward a little bit. This is the assassination details. We can go back to this if you want. But the opening prologue of my book is something, when you're writing about an obscure historical figure, you need to make a case very early on as to why this person matters and what their significance is, why the reader should keep reading. And the scene that I used for my prologue, it was always clear to me what it was going to be. It was going to be Garfield returning from his nominating convention to Hiram, because the day after he was nominated, he was due to be here to give a commencement speech for the latest class of Hiram graduates. So his convoy from Chicago to Hiram, it's a series of train rides and carriage rides, very interesting and compelling stuff. But he gives this commencement speech. He's handed the stage by Burke Hinsdale, his great friend and inheritor of this place. And Garfield gives this great line. He writes, "While I have been sitting here this afternoon, as presidential nominee, it occurred to me that the best thing you all have is perhaps the thing you care for least, and that is your leisure. The leisure you have to think in and to be let alone," that says alone, it should be alone. "The leisure you have to throw the plummet with your hands. The leisure you have to walk about the towers of yourselves and find out how strong or how weak they are, and determine which need building up and how to shape them, that you may be made the final being that you are to be." Does that sound like leisure? No, that sounds awful. That's one thing that struck me was, he is back here, he is among his kind, fellow, members of the Western Reserve community who are still in many ways kind of an agrarian / developing industrial society. Cleveland's getting bigger and bigger, of course, much bigger than when Garfield was young. And he's congratulating everybody on all their free time. He says, and now you have all this free time that you can use to find out how much harder you need to work in other parts of yourself. And it shows you, as I put in the book, that he never really knew what leisure was. His whole life was work. And it's a very inspiring story. And after, by the way, he gets into the White House, he writes this wonderful letter to Burke Hinsdale. And he writes, I throw you a line across the storm to let you know that I think when I have a moment between breaths of the dear old quiet and peace of Hiram and Menor. Let me hear from you, as ever yours, James A. Garfield. Top of the letterhead, Executive Mansion. March 26, 1881. He's in the midst of the political battles that would actually indirectly lead to his murder. And that's a story we can get to in the Q&A session, I think, if you'd like to go there. But I wanted to keep this focused on this place and how much it meant to him and how important it was to his ascent. When James Garfield is remembered these days, it is for everything that he accomplished in an incredibly short and tragic life in many ways. But he couldn't have done it without this place. What this place made him and how he made Hiram. And it's a fascinating story that it was really just my pleasure to write more about. And I'll end on this. This is a line that Garfield said when he was leaving Hiram for Williams College. He and a friend, they go to New York, because that's how you needed to get to Massachusetts those days. From Ohio, you needed to travel by train down to New York City, and then you would go up the Hudson. So you're going down to New York and then up to Massachusetts. And he stops in the center of Manhattan with his friend, and they see a fruit stall. And they see this weirdly colored object in the fruit stall. It's this yellow dash of color. And these two Ohio boys, they stop and they go, "What is that?" And the fruit seller goes, "Oh, haha, very funny. He thinks it's a joke. He thinks he's having his light pulled." And then Garfield and this other boy from Hiram go, "No, seriously, what is that?" And the seller goes, "That's a banana. Don't you know what a banana is?" And so they get made fun of and they walk away. And then Garfield gives this great line that I use in the book. And he goes, the longer version is before this line. He goes, that fruit peddler thinks we were a fool for asking what every urchin here in New York knows. But I have long since determined not to let an opportunity pass for learning something, simply because I must expose my ignorance in so doing. Which is a great line, shows you the spirit of the guy. It's also a great line to start a Q&A session on. So, questions, if you have any.
In your introduction, you make a brief reference to the way in which Garfield is remembered in popular culture. You mentioned a song that I don't think I had ever heard of before.
Oh, yeah, you're right. So you're talking about from the book.
Yeah. The introduction to your book.
Yeah, right.
So I've listened to the Johnny Cash song, but I don't know whether that was a folk song that was begun shortly after his death,
right,
or whether it was something that wasn't written until much later.
Yeah, so Cash recorded that song.
Right. It
is unclear whether he actually wrote it or not. What was interesting about, so Johnny Cash, by the way, one of the songs that Johnny Cash wrote, this didn't chart, but it was, it's called Mr. Garfield, and it was this kind of classic Johnny Cash, kind of like train rhythm, song. It's him saying, "Mr. Garfield's been shot down low." It's from the perspective of somebody who's in D.C. when Garfield gets shot. And with a lot of songs, especially from that time, it's unclear who the original author was, especially with songs in the folk tradition. Right. So I'm not sure if Cash actually was the original writer, but it's like, it's like that song, "You Are My Sunshine," which was supposedly written and recorded by a former governor of Louisiana. But there's a lot of talk that it had actually been recorded beforehand. That's almost the evolution of the music business. But that was a funny little anecdote, wasn't it? Yeah, those little things. That is something else.
What kind of a relationship did Garfield and Lincoln have?
They had a complicated one, to say the least. The person who had to convince James Garfield to leave the Army and accept his seat in Congress was Abraham Lincoln. Garfield had this crazy notion. I'll actually go back a little bit. So when he got elected to Congress, he was still in the Army. This is a series of photographs that was taken by Matthew Brady, very famous Civil War photographer. And it's actually the cover of the book is this, one of these 8 photographs, and it's been colorized obviously on the book cover. But the caption is very interesting. The caption is the Honorable / General James Garfield, because he hadn't decided whether to stay in the Army or accept a seat in Congress or not by that point. But Garfield tells the story about coming to DC from the Battle of Chickamauga. And he has just been made a Major General. He is, again, now he genuinely is the youngest Major General in the Union Army. And he asks Lincoln whether he could do more service in the Army, in uniform, or in Congress. And Lincoln says to him, "We have more need for Republican generals in Congress than congressmen in the Army." So the way of getting him in. Garfield wanted to hear that answer. Garfield becomes a radical Republican, and he becomes a genuine thorn in Lincoln's side. Radicals are very upset that Lincoln is not fighting, the war in a more abolitionist, ambitious purpose. And so there are tremendous points of friction between the radicals and Lincoln, and Garfield is very happy to criticize Lincoln as often as he can. He actually, it seems for a while that his renomination for his congressional seat is in jeopardy, because he comes home here and he's being accused of being too disruptive to the Republican Party with how fiercely he's supposedly criticizing Lincoln and Lincoln's plans for Reconstruction. So that's a really interesting kind of background there. It gets more complicated though, because Lincoln is of course assassinated, and Garfield's views of him switch on a dime. And he writes, he's in New York at the time that Lincoln is assassinated, and he writes back to his wife and he says, "Could I have but you and our darling boy in my arms, I could forget the world in the dark," which is a really uncharacteristic piece of reflection. Anyway, Garfield gives a very famous eulogy for Lincoln in the House about a year or so after the assassination. And then you get to Garfield's administration. He's trying to piece together a very delicate Republican coalition. And who does he pick for his Secretary of War? It's Robert Todd Lincoln. It's Lincoln's last surviving son. And Robert Todd Lincoln happens to also be he happens also to be in the train station where Garfield is shot. He's there on the scene. And then if you go to the McKinley administration, Robert Todd Lincoln is also somewhat on the scene of McKinley's assassination. So Robert Todd Lincoln was at all the first 3 assassinated presidents. He was pretty much there in some way, shape, or form when it happened. Robert Todd Lincoln went on to say, "I refuse to meet any more presidents." Yes, I believe it is. I think James Blaine's history of this period, of this legislative history of this period, he writes from Lincoln to Garfield. That's seen as being they're end posts on the Civil War and then the end of Reconstruction is those two. So it's the bonds are deep and complicated. Yep.
Would you be willing to say something about his relationship with Almeda Booth and perhaps with women of Hiram?
Yes, this is also a very complicated issue, because depending on the author, depending on the biographer, was he starved for female affection? Was he kind of a bit of a rake in terms of being too flirtatious with many women in town? Garfield's overall relationship with women is very complicated. With Almeda Booth, she was, in his view, certainly the most intelligent person in the Hiram orbit, and perhaps in the state of Ohio. He gave this very compelling eulogy for her, actually, when she died. And he always respected her intellectual capability. And this is kind of the product of the times, but Almeda was also, if you read about old accounts of her, everybody seems compelled to comment on her physical appearance, which was apparently not particularly attractive to other men. And for some reason, that's something everybody brings up. And the relationship between her and James was they were very close. They were seemingly unusually friendly for men and women of that time. Garfield would write of seeing her as an elder sister. And there's always a bit of ambiguity about whether she felt more strongly about him. There are other women, if you look back, that Garfield had friendships with that were subject to a lot of speculation and gossip, especially his with Rebecca Selleck, as another person kind of in this community. But his with Lucretia Rudolph, daughter of Zebulon Rudolph, one of the founding trustees of this school. Garfield and Lucretia had what has been described as at one point the worst marriage that a president has ever had with their spouse. And on the other side of the spectrum, eventually, one of the best. And this can be illustrated in a few points. When Garfield finally decided to marry her, it was after about 4 to 5 years of engagement, which was a scandalously long time to be engaged by that period. And on their wedding night, Garfield wrote in his diary, he didn't write, "I married Lucretia Rudolph." He wrote, "I was married to Lucretia Rudolph by so-and-so being a preacher in the area." So it was passive. It wasn't something he was actively diving into. And then, partway through the war, he has an affair. He has an affair with a New York journalist, actually. And that is the nadir of their relationship. And it ends up becoming a very important turning point, though. Whether the standards of the day prevented them from taking another step, perhaps divorce, that's possible. But you fast forward about 10 to 12 years, and the Garfields have a famously, healthy, happy marriage. They have genuinely grown close to each other. Garfield would write in his letters to her, they used to say that all roads lead to Rome. In the directory of my life, all roads lead to Crete, lead to Lucretia Garfield. And then he would always use the same line. He would use the same line over and over again whenever asked about the secret of his marriage and its happiness by journalists. They would ask him, so how did you pull this off? How have you created such a happy, healthy home life? And he would say, "I've been wonderfully blessed in the disposition of my wife. She is unstampedable." And that phrase, unstampedable, implies really a stampede. And as you all probably know, if any of you have visited Longfield in Menor, that place, his legacy owes a lot to her work after he died. She was there by his bedside throughout the closing days after he was wounded. A very compelling and complicated love story, I'd argue. Yeah. Okay, yes.